of information. Global terrorism, which has traditionally formed the end of this class. And it is still a very timely subject, considering the attacks that have happened over the past few weeks in Paris and Beirut, not to mention the Russian plane crash in Sinai. Terrorism, more than 10 years since I started teaching this class, has certainly evolved along with counterterrorism struggles. When I first started teaching this class back in 2003, 2004, the main enemy was Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda at this point is your grandfather's terrorist organization, and unfortunately they have gotten only worse over the years. Particularly when we take a look at the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, if you want to use the Arab acronym, effectively controlling large swaths of territory in Syria, Iraq, and we always tend to forget this other country as well, Libya, not to mention parts of Yemen as well. But what exactly then is terrorism? Because terrorist studies are a relatively new field to international relations and are really dominating the international security studies, but terrorism more than anything else, before you even start writing any of this stuff down, terrorism, just in its raw, basic form, comprises a series of challenges that openly challenge prevailing attitudes of the IR field. Terrorism is also, at its rawest form, an entity that lays bare the weaknesses of previously thought secure international arrangements. Terrorism takes even the most liberally consolidated state and turns fears around to the point where people are debating even today what is more important to safeguard, national security or civil liberties. Does one require the other? Or do we need to focus on the first before we can enjoy the second? When we look at terrorism in a more formal definition, and here I'm not talking specifically about ISIS or anything else, but I'm talking about a concept. And terrorism has certainly existed for decades, if not centuries, though it has not become part of the IR subject, at least until the last 10, 15 or so years. Terrorism in its rawest form is understood to be a policy intended to create and spread fear. That's ultimately what it is. Terrorism is a ways to spread fear. Fear, paranoia, doubt, mistrust, effectively the things that undermine the basic tenets of modern sovereignty. Terrorism is often associated very closely with an ideological goal. Right? Terrorism is not violence just for the sake of violence, but terrorism has some kind of ethos. It has some kind of objective, some kind of ideological goal to achieve. And whether that is independence for a group, territorial acquisition, access to certain degrees of power or resources, or just simply the overthrow of power, of authority, and of a sovereign state. Okay? Terrorism is a type of violence that is unconventional when compared with more formal levels of aggression for two reasons. Number one, terrorism, by spreading fear, deliberately targets non-combatants. And in conventional warfare, there's at least a general understanding that armies will attack other armies. Civilians are off the table. At least when we talk about the norms of warfare, if one can, consider warfare to have norms. If you're wearing a uniform, you're, fair game. If you're a civilian, you're off targets, you're off limits. Terrorism doesn't care. As a matter of fact, terrorism deliberately goes after non-combatants because they are the defenseless ones. They are the ones that are not engaged in any kind of combat. The other type of unconventionality is that it comes without warning. It not only attacks non-combatants, but it also targets civilian locations. So, schools, hospitals, buildings, bus stations, restaurants, theaters. When we look at the 9/11 attacks, the closest thing that we could consider to be a military installation was the Pentagon. But the most visual representation of terrorism out of 9/11 was the attack on the World Trade Center, which at the end of the day doesn't do much except cause really, really visual horror. We're not talking about attacking army installations. We're not even talking about attacking Wall Street, for that matter. But we're talking about 2 buildings in downtown New York. When we look at the attacks in Paris a week or so ago, we're looking at attacks at theaters and cafes and restaurants, not places of government, not places of any form of military apparatus. And in that case, it leaves civilians with this uneasy feeling that terrorism can strike whenever, however, without any other type of warning. The other thing to look at it is that it is unlawful violence and unconventional warfare. So we're not talking about specifically guns, but we're talking about bombs. We're talking about poison. We're talking about what we would call more clandestine forms of aggression. The things that make the news are the gunmen that kind of storm in and shoot everybody up. The things that don't make the news are things like cyber warfare, cyber terrorism, environmental terrorism, or better yet, just simply attacking resources like water and other areas that can easily cripple a community within 24 hours. So with that in mind, and it is somewhat of a happy subject to talk about in between Thanksgiving and Christmas, terrorism is really caused for 2 things. It's not just the ideological drive, but it is the visual impact, the fear that it causes. In that case, terrorism is meant for visual and psychological means rather than strategic. Which gives us also an understanding that terrorist organizations try to at least represent themselves as small enemies against a larger, more powerful organization. It's kind of like a David versus Goliath scenario, in that terrorism will strike not the heart of security and power, but it will attack soft targets as a way of psychologically undermining the world order, and as a way of reminding said world order that there is a rage from below. There is a silent minority that can, will, and will continue to attack the status quo. And there's very little that the status quo can do. Because one of the basic understandings of counterterrorism strategies is that counterterrorism needs to be effective 100% of the time in order to give the impression that they're doing their job. The terrorist can try to attack 100 times. It can fail 99. All it takes is one success story. And that dominates the news, that feeds into paranoia, that leads to a public backlash, and that effectively undermines the basic Wilsonian liberalist international order that we thought were secure for years, if not decades. Now, there is a difference between terrorism and global terrorism, because global terrorism is something that we really haven't experienced more than 15 or so, 20 years ago. In this case, global terrorism is just as much a product of the age of globalization as any other form of information. Global terrorism, simply put, is terrorism that can strike around the world. Terrorist organizations that have a global reach and provide a global impact. Al-Qaeda was really one of the first major global terrorist organizations. ISIS has since taken over Al-Qaeda's mantle and has proven that it can attack and it can create violence in various places around the world. Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and we're not even sure about how many times they tried, but were foiled here in the United States. Another understanding about global terrorism is that it is an entity that has the ability of affecting the international system. So if you think about the Ken Walt's 3 tiers of analysis that we've been talking about, terrorist organizations are non-state actors and yet have the ability of not only influencing the international system, but affecting the way in which states and international organizations frame their decision-making. What non-state actors do in the global world for the first time has been able to show that they can work on par with state actors. And what we also find is that these global terrorist organizations have no fixed location. They have no flag, they have no postal code, they have no representation at the United Nations, they have no particular national identity. They are, in fact, nameless, stateless actors. They are, for all intents and purposes, international organizations, but very unconventional international organizations. Organizations that have led the formal international community to take necessary precautions against them. One of the best examples of this, I want to talk about a global impact. Al-Qaeda, after 9/11, was the first non-state actor in which a sovereign nation declared war on. After 9/11, the United States, in so many words, declared war on a man, declared war on an idea, whereas beforehand you declared war on a state, or at the absolute conceptual, you declared war on an ideology. Let's talk about that ideology. Okay? Terrorism and ideology in this case are almost always associated with some extreme, non-negotiable, uncompromising socio-political position. It doesn't necessarily have to be religious. It doesn't even have to be political. But it certainly is fundamentalist. It is a type of goal that does not seek compromise, that does not seek concessions, but seeks an extreme, almost puritanical vision. Some examples of these can either be the establishment or more likely the destruction of a state. The destruction of Israel, the destruction of Saudi Arabia, paradoxically, the destruction of American world order, in some cases even the destruction of the United States. And this isn't necessarily related to one religion. The last incident of what we can call terrorism happened a few days ago with Planned Parenthood. Terrorism is not simply Islamic. Terrorists come in all shapes and sizes. Terrorists can be Muslim, they can be Christian, they can be Jewish, they can be Buddhist. It's hard to believe, but it does happen. And yes, snotty internet comment section, they can also be atheists. So it has no particular proclivity towards one religion or another. But what it does do, at least in terms of what we can find a common thread between all of them, is that terrorism is a type of weapon of the weak. It is a rage from below. It is a type of anti-establishment that seeks to not so much overthrow the establishment, but show how weak and pathetically organized said establishment is. And in that understanding, terrorism is probably the biggest antithesis to liberalism. We were talking about one IR school of thought, probably the most antithetical towards liberalism, because over the past few weeks and months we've been arguing that liberalism is trying to argue that the more reason and rationality enter into international debate, the less fear and uncertainty will be. And if you play the liberalism card to its philosophical end, liberalism should, through the use of cooperation and transnationalism, reduce fear, reduce uncertainty, all those things that realists say kind of permeates the international arena. Terrorism brings us right back to square one. Terrorism takes that preconceived notion of security and effectively provides a Nelson and shows the world, guess what? All of your feelings of security, of order and stability, I laugh at that. And what I've also been arguing ever since constructivism, when in doubt, states default to realism. So what terrorism also does is that it takes the comfortable setting of liberalism and bring foreign policy, bring national security back to realpolitik. We were just about, in the late 1990s, ready to classify realism as a historical theory of IR. And then Bin Bin comes along and reminds us, oh, America, you thought that you were surrounded on two sides by relatively large oceans and two other sides by relatively innocuous countries. I can still hit you. I can still attack. So the ideology of terrorism is more than just simply the goal, but the ideology of the response, the ideology of fear. And yes, even though Islam is not coterminous with terrorism, there is something to be said about some of the most violent global terrorist movements around the world today, speaking in the name of Islam. And I say speaking in the name, not being Islamic. One thing we've learned through the few ISIS cells that we've been able to capture is that these guys know less about Islam than Mike Huckabee does. Okay? So we're not exactly talking about theologians. We're not exactly talking about people that have read their Quran and Hadiths from start to finish. But still, the inconvenient truth is that when we look at Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other groups that are operating in these troubled areas around the world, they operate in the name of some type of puritanical, aggressive, uncompromising form of Islam. And it has less to do, in my opinion, with some screwed up theology than it does with a number of pre-existing conditions that realism and liberalism cannot really explain. If you really want to get to the roots of the causes surrounding global Islamic terrorism, you have to actually look at a theory that most people have disregarded, and that's Marxism. Or more specifically, world systems theory. Because when we look at the rise of terrorism within Muslim-dominated countries, they're almost always associated with economic imbalances, highly corrupt governments that almost border on the verge of failed states, a pattern of Western, what I would call imperialism, but put that really in quotes because we're not talking about colonies here. Right? The West stopped colonizing the Middle East shortly after the Second World War. But imperialism in the economic sense. Imperialism also in the diplomatic sense. When we talk about Western-backed governments that are as tyrannical, as corrupt, and as unpopular as they come in places like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and yes, even Turkey. Okay? And finally, this rather colloquial term, the rage of the bizarre, which is really a tongue-in-cheek phrase that means the rage from below. The rage from below. And the one thing we need to understand about countries within the Middle East is that Islam is not necessarily a religious doctrine that people look to as a way of getting back at those that are screwing over your life. But Islam has had a rather political overtone as well. This is something that the separation of church and state world have found difficult to understand, is that there is a very close relationship between religious, political, and social Islam that functions as a form of organization to manage day-to-day life. Now, with that said, the other thing I want to make apparent is that this type of Islam didn't really dominate people's lives over the past 10, 20, 30 years. This is a relatively new thing. The reason why Islam becomes almost a political, social alternative to those of the established states in the Middle East is largely because there are no other political opposition movements. Islam is almost like the default opposition against what many regard as entrenched, corrupt, authoritative regimes. So Islam in this regard is less of a religious function and more of a social and cultural counterbalance. And obviously, extremists within that camp are going to use that as a form of violence against that established order. Now, this type of political Islam has very little ability in altering or challenging the political system. That much is painfully obvious. These regimes are entrenched, they have backing from Western powers, and they don't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon. That's not really the issue. The issue is more so within the economic and the social sectors. When you know that you are part of a group, when you are part of a social clique that has an advantage over everyone else, you get the best schools, you get the best life, you get access to money, you get access to power, and you are a small, small group of people within that country. You're going to do your damnedest to ensure that that is maintained. What happens if you're born on the outside? What happens if you're born not within that group of people that run the country. There's only so far you can go. This is what we would call the glass ceiling. In the absence of a middle class, in the absence of any kind of real, legitimate socioeconomic mobility, people really in the Middle East have got three options, three general options. First option is to buy into the system, which means that they end up undercutting their own beliefs and effectively just assume the power and prominence of the regime in power. You effectively buy into the system, you get everything you want. Yay. But that rarely happens. Number two, you get on a plane, get on a proverbial boat, and you go someplace else. I'm going to go to America. I'm going to go to Canada. I'm going to go to Europe. And I'm going to try to build a life someplace else. Now, immigrants are rarely people that are welcomed in the countries that they arrive in. The United States has less a problem with dealing with them than Europe of late. The trouble is that you come in as an immigrant, you're oftentimes faced with huge degrees of prejudice as well as obstacles towards achieving your goal. Doesn't mean that we're preventing it from you from getting, but most of the time when people go to Europe, they are effectively denied the very same rights and privileges that they were denied in the Middle East. Or the third option, you just sit there and do nothing, and you just kind of accept your lot in life until it just gets worse and worse and worse and more oppressive and more oppressive. So finally, someone comes along and says, hey, don't like your lot in life, don't like what's going on in the world, take your anger out in ways. And that is what attracts a small percentage of people towards the extremist camp. Those that have little to nothing to lose, those are the ones that do the most damage. And in that regard, the type of terrorism that describes Islam in this regard is more of a product of economic and political conditions than it is with any type of religion that is any more aggressive or benign than its religious or theological counterparts. Okay? So when we look then at all of this, and we try to place it within the realm of IR studies, we're still writing that chapter. We're still trying to figure out, number one, what impact this is going to have in the international arena. And number two, and this is probably the more important one, how do we deal with it? Okay? How do we effectively reconcile ourselves with the threat of global terror? Because first off, the first thing we have to understand is that conventional IR studies is unprepared for this stuff. Especially when we talk about warfare, diplomacy, and other forms of compromise. You don't open up diplomatic missions with terrorist movements. Many of them are disinterested in any form of compromise. Effectively, what we've got are non-state actors taking the role of states in so many words. First of all, non-state actors taking the role of states in terms of threat, in terms of control of territory, in terms of access to resources. These are not just a bunch of angry people running around with AK-47s. These organizations are highly developed, highly sophisticated, and run on monetary networks, the likes of which conventional states can only be jealous of. When we talk about, let's say, the financial roots, the financial reach of Al-Qaeda, you read the 9/11 Commission report, you find out that these groups have escrow accounts in dozens of countries, have access to money through various laundering, charity donations, and this, there, the other thing, making money off of something, making money off of smuggled oil, off of drugs, off of trafficking, off of all sorts of vice that effectively makes them economically self-sustaining. Right now, ISIS, just through controlling parts of Iraq and Syria, are making millions of dollars a day through the control of the oil wells that they have, and selling those oil barrels to neighboring countries at cheaper prices, but they're making money hand over fist. The other thing that we have to understand is that terrorism in this regard adds to the general understanding of IR studies in the global arena, that individuals now have more power than ever before in influencing foreign policy. Back in the proverbial day, it was your occasional Napoleon, Hitler, or Bismarck. Today, people who are part of these organizations, who otherwise had no access to power, no influence on someone else's life, through the use of a video camera and an internet news feed, can basically cause fear and doubt to millions of people around the world by issuing threats or decapitating people live. Long after Osama bin Laden, we have names like Ayman al-Zawahiri, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and the guy that we colloquially refer to as Jihadi John. Okay? And they don't necessarily come from the Middle East either. They come from Western countries. They come from Europe. They come from the United States. They are well trained. They're well educated. And man, they've got a vendetta. They've got a huge bone to pick with the Western world. The other thing that's paradoxical about these organizations is that their ideology may be somewhat medieval. Their goals may be, especially when we talk about ISIS, their goals may be something like, resurrecting or creating a caliphate from the 7th century. And yet, they are as media savvy, as tech savvy, and as cyber savvy as any established company or corporation today. Their ability to facilitate war wherever and whenever they want, particularly with total disregard to sovereign boundaries, effectively undermines the very premise of the Westphalian system that we've been talking about since day one. And the worst part about it is that their armies are basically masses. They're not soldiers. They're not professional soldiers. But they're everybody and anybody. You have people here in the United States, they get bored with their life, they're angry at the world, and trust me, the internet is a wonderful, wonderful mechanism to take a grudge and turn it into a personal hatred for humanity. The internet comment section really does that to certain people. What else do you do? Simple. Buy a plane ticket, leave the country, fly to the Middle East, and join up with Cobra. Few weeks, few months later, you're given a job. And it's not just marching in front of a camera in Syria, but it's also training to eventually attack targets here in the West, whether it's Europe or in the United States. Of course, one final thing to that is that when we talk about global terrorism today, especially when we're relating it to Islamic terrorism, it kind of reinforces these unfortunately stereotypical and highly prejudicial assessments that policymakers since the 1990s have been giving about large parts of the world, the so-called clash of civilizations that Sam Huntington rather infamously had coined about 20 to 25 years ago, leads many people to conclude that a war on terror is also a war between the West and the East, or more specifically, the West versus Islam. So we talk about also the threat of global terrorism. There are many cases in which the imbalance between one part of the world and another are not rectified, but they're actually reinforced. Before the Paris bombing, very few people in France thought about attacking ISIS. After the Paris bombing, public approval in France overwhelmingly called for a complete and unmitigated attack in Syria. Same thing happened here in the United States. You have to remember, Al-Qaeda existed well before 2001, well before 9/11. Al-Qaeda existed in some capacity as early as the mid-1990s. We never really thought about them. We didn't really care much about the embassy bombings in Africa or the USS Cole bombing shortly afterwards. It was only after 9/11 where we decided to, go America, fuck yeah, type of thing, right? And that's largely because of where it comes from and the messages that are being sent. So the other problem with the relationship between global terrorism and IR studies is that it reinforces these prejudices between the West and the Islamic world, where one sees the other as a perpetual and perennial enemy. Okay. Being a little bit more specific here now, okay? The international system that we thought was nicely organized, nicely designed by the mid-1990s is beginning to come unraveled. And you look at the way in which the world is today, and people are becoming incredibly pessimistic. People are wondering, are we losing international security faster than we're regaining it? Since the late 90s, and particularly after the 9/11 attacks, okay, the so-called war on terror that the United States and other countries of the so-called West have been waging has been as conceptual, has been as malleable, and has been as hazy as the previous war on drugs. It's a never-ending battle where there's no clear victory in sight. You know, you get rid of one terrorist cell, another one forms. You get rid of bin Laden, and another group establishes itself, right? You clear out one town, and you end up creating problems someplace else. Here, I'll give you a really good example of how the war on terror has been a challenge, at least to conventional warfare. About 10 years ago, I was teaching this class. One of the very first times I was teaching this class, there's a student who just came back from his military tour of Middle East. He had been a soldier in Iraq. He'd been stationed in Ramadi, which is one of the towns in the so-called Sunni Triangle. And I remember exactly what he had said. This was both brilliant and disheartening at the same time. Because he says that while his platoon was on patrol in Ramadi, they knew two things. Two things were absolutely certain. Number one, the town was effectively infiltrated by no more than 10 Al-Qaeda operatives. Right? Ramadi has got hundreds, about thousands of people. Maybe about 10 Al-Qaeda operatives that kind of seeped into the town. But you never see them. And the second thing that they know is that every time that they went out to perform some kind of combat operation, 90% of the time, the combatants were ordinary Iraqis, and they knew that. Here's the paradox, here's the situation that he says. There's maybe about 5 to 10 Al-Qaeda bad guys that come into a town, and they've got two proverbial bags in their hand. One is a sack full of cash. The other one is a sack full of weapons. And they go into a building, they hold themselves up, and you never hear from them again. They've got 1 or 2 people that are kind of like the marketing agents that go out into the public square every single day and goes to an ordinary Iraqi and says something along the following lines. Hey, I know times are tough. I know that you really have no money to feed your family. Hey, I've got an idea. I'll give you $100 right now. I'll give you $100 right now if you take this RPG, and in about 20 minutes, because Americans are, if anything, punctual, in about 20 minutes, this Humvee is going to come around the corner over here. I want you to take that RPG, I want you to shoot it at the Humvee. Now, 2 things are going to happen. One, the Americans are going to spot you and kill you, and you will die a martyr's death, and your 72 virgins, and blah, 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 right? Allah will be happy about you, whatever. Or you're going to blow up the Humvee, and I'm going to give you another $150 afterwards for fulfilling your deed. Oh, and by the way, you can't take no for an answer because we already know who you are. So more often than not, ordinary Iraqis are forced into this. Okay, so you've got this RPG. Now this guy, the student that I said he knew every single time. They'd be on a platoon, somebody would come out with a gun, with an IED, with an RPG. And the American soldier, doesn't matter whether it's American, British, French, whatever it is, they're effectively trained to protect their own platoon. So when you see somebody coming out with a gun, you have a split second to decide whether it's a friendly or whether it's an enemy. And when someone's pointing an RPG at your Humvee, you shoot first because you don't want to take those risks. The problem is that 9 times out of 10, they knew. And they shot the guy. It was an ordinary civilian. The minute that they shoot the guy, and they effectively save their lives, the operative comes out and says, oh, look at that, the Americans killed another Iraqi, and let's get the Al Jazeera camera on there and look at how evil these Americans are. What does that do? That gets Iraqis pissed off. Right? So there's not much you can do. If the guy had succeeded in blowing up the Humvee, Al-Qaeda wins. If the guy was killed before the Humvee was blown up, Al-Qaeda still wins, because the bad guys that came into the town, they're still there. What do they care? They can find somebody else. So the nature of warfare has completely changed. because it is difficult, if not impossible, to separate soldier from civilian. That's the nature of terrorism these days. And it continues in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, and it continues even worse now under ISIS. Especially when ISIS controls vast swaths of territory in Syria and Iraq, having the ability of exerting influence on the world economic markets. So for a group that has a mentality that even predates the 7th century, because trust me, you know, if you were to go back in time and talk with 7th century Muslims in the caliphate, they'd look at these people and say, these guys are nuts. These guys are absolute barbarians. So we're talking about an ideology that wouldn't even predate the 7th century. They have access to this power and that degree of influence. And what are the residual effects? Ever since 9/11, democracies, particularly the United States, have been determined of beefing up national security and rooting out problems before it exists. And ever since then, the state has assumed greater realpolitik attitudes. Things like the Patriot Act that give the government inordinate degrees of power of surveillance, as we've seen through NSA, as we've seen through what WikiLeaks has uncovered. The idea that the government of the United States, Great Britain, and others are effectively becoming surveillance governments, all for the sake of protecting you, is again another paradox about terrorism. Because on one level you think my civil liberties are being limited, my civil liberties are being undermined, and yet the minute that we kind of pull back on national security, something blows up that shouldn't, we blame the government for not protecting us. Okay? That's the paradox of terrorism. That's the paradox of the way in which the world is today. The minute that we start feeling, oh God, do I have to wait 3 hours at the freaking airport now? The minute that something happens in New York, London, Madrid, Paris, we're right back to the beginning again. Right back to the beginning. Okay? Things that happened in Beirut, this is the thing. How many of you noted? Remember it was a couple of weeks ago when the Paris attack happened? How many of you were on that bandwagon that you decided you're going to change your profile picture to a French flag, you stand with the French people, you know, je suis français, everything else like that, right? And then there's that one annoying friend of yours that was like, dude, we never did anything for Beirut. And you were like, oh yeah, you're right, I feel like idiots, right? Here's the thing. Most of the people who forgot about Beirut forgot about it because this type of shit is supposed to happen in Beirut. Right? It's supposed to happen. Oh, you read about an explosion in Baghdad, an explosion in Damascus, an explosion in that part of the world. Okay, it happens in Paris, it happens in New York, it happens in Detroit, it happens in Chicago. That shouldn't happen. So even there, the differences between so-called civilizations are unfortunately being exacerbated. Ultimately, what this all means is that global terrorism, if I'm going to look at this in a completely academic setting, global terrorism is essentially a clash between established understandings of transnational liberalism, advocating open borders, greater senses of cooperation, right? Democratic peace theory, versus whenever something like that happens, I would even go so far as to say neo-classical realism. And I was thinking about this. What type of realism really works? Theoretical realism is too much of a philosophy. I'm not going to worry about that one. Structural realism is too scientific to really make a point. Neoclassical realism, the realism of E.H. Carr, the realism of Morgenthau, the realism that says liberalism, seriously hippies, give it a rest, is the one that's coming back. This type of neoclassical realism is the realism that permeates the foreign policies of the United States, of Russia, of France. It speaks for the voice, it really is the voice of the Republican Party these days. Those that call for greater surveillance of particular people. The deportation of people that are regarded as less than loyal. And what it ultimately ends up doing is erecting walls again. This is the funny thing. A couple of weeks ago, Europe was celebrating 20 years of, 25 years, the Berlin Wall coming down. Yay, Berlin Wall comes down, like the most symbolic barrier between people. And right at that moment, as people were celebrating, happy birthday, Berlin Wall coming down, European countries were erecting barriers at their borders again to keep refugees from Syria out. And of course, the understanding. How many of these refugees are coming into Europe and how many of them are actual ISIS agents? Oh, that's stupid, that's racist, how can you say that? You see, I told you, all it takes is one. That's right, let's get rid of them. And suddenly, it's West versus East once again. Congratulations. Zawahiri has won.